Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I'm the host of today's event. To fellow Gray Swans, glad you can join us. To Swan curious and interested observers, welcome. Thanks for sharing part of your day with us. We're coming up on 1 year. If you don't know about us, we are the Gray Swan Guild is a global league of sensemakers. We're brought together by extraordinary times, and we're taking what we've all learned individually through our own work and our practices and trying to find some common ground and common solutions. There's a saying that I'm fond of, which is that all of us are smarter than any of us. And even though that sounds a little like consultant speak, it definitely applies to the Guild's activities. If you'd like to learn some more about us, there will be how to get involved, how to introduce members of your own network to our activities. Please check out the links above. We'll put them out later and also in the chat window. So today is the second, maybe third, not sure about that. It's the second one that I've been part of, webinar focused on the impact of the pandemic. As we all know, this year has been a stress test for ourselves, our political, economic, cultural institutions, our civilization as a whole. Some lasting damage has been done, but new opportunities have emerged as well. So in the previous webinar, we looked mostly through the dark lens of the challenges. Today, we're going to be putting on the rose-colored glasses and looking at the potential solutions and the potential upsides of this. One last bit of housekeeping before we get going. If you are a Guild member or if you're interested in our activities, we have another poll out right now, which is on our member survey. This is your chance to have a say on the priorities you'd like to see, how the Guild evolves into its second year. So please take a moment over the next week or so, go through the survey, let us know your thoughts about more upcoming events. There's going to be some other announcements at the end of this program to go through. So quick word, I'm just about to introduce our panelists. We have a packed program of stuff today. We're going to try and hit the highlights of this Weathervane survey, which polled our members and also interested parties on the net to get your thoughts on what's going on. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. If you have some questions, put them in the chat window. We will try to accommodate those time permitting. I know some of our panelists have hard stops at the top of the hour. If we don't get to your question, might end up being fodder for the next round of Guild content. So we're always interested in thoughts and open conversation, and we're hoping that we can do that. So without further ado, let me introduce our pandemic panelist solution experts, starting with Joan Ball, our liminal navigator.
Hi, how are you? My name is Joan Ball. I'm here in New York. I teach at St. John's University in the business school there. I also run an organization called Womb Lab, where I help people navigate transitions. I've never called myself a liminal navigator before, but I like it. I might take it. And so I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Our tech disruptor, Howard Fields. You are on mute, Howard. Unmute.
Sorry about that. Not quite sure how that happened. I don't think anybody's ever called me a tech disruptor before. I am a business disruptor, though. I've done that much of my career. I'm also in the greater New York area and have also taught at the same university that Joan has along the way. I come from a background in Fortune 100 tech companies, IBM and Cisco. More recently, the last few years, I've been doing a lot of startup work. And that is what has led me to the Guild. I bill myself as a sense maker at the intersection of human behavior and technology. It's all about how you get the value out of the technology if you're a business person. And that's a bit of my background. Nice to meet you all.
Excellent. And our sense-making alchemist, Viktoria Mikhailova. And parenthetically, I posted this on Facebook earlier, and somebody said, I want to be a sense-making alchemist. And I responded that I think these captions were generated by a random word generator. But I think if the hat fits anybody, it's you, Victoria.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for introductions, Rob, and I'm very glad to be here today and to share with you also thoughts and reflections. I'm co-founder of the company called Sensemakers, and a couple of years ago we decided with my co-founders to bring more wisdom into action and to bring more wisdom into the organizational world. So what we are doing, basically, we are creating the alchemy in the companies through two things: through the connections and also through the wisdom, through the reflections about the world, and putting the sense in the core of the business models. So I also teach leadership in the two business schools at HEC Paris in France and at Skolkovo School of Management in Moscow.
And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rob Salkowitz. I am a writer, consultant, educator based in Seattle, Washington. I also teach at the University of Washington in the Communication Leadership Program. I have author of several books. I write for Forbes, and I have a consulting practice based on storytelling and strategy for everything from startups to global organizations trying to connect better with their audience. So great, glad to have you all with us. Let's, before we begin, I want to start with a Gray Swan Guild tradition, which is that everybody share one piece of good news, either from your personal life or a piece of news that you saw, recently, to get us started on a high note. Victoria, you want to start us off?
Yes, thank you. So the good news that I would like to share, that I started yesterday my new experience on the Clubhouse, and it was amazing because I love really the way that people can join the discussions and they can share. And yesterday we had a great discussion about the partnership relations in the work spaces and also in the life of the entrepreneurs and the startuppers. So that was an amazing experience, and also very good news from France, where I'm sitting, that we are getting more and more vaccinated. And I believe that people will be happy to go out and socialize again, and to go to the theaters, which are still closed up. But now our government is announcing good news very soon.
Hey, Joan, how about you? What's good in your life right now?
Well, I don't think either Victoria or I have stock in Clubhouse, but my good news was going to be a Clubhouse good news as well. I also have been playing in that space and have some really interesting interviews coming up in my club there. So if anyone is on Clubhouse, would really love to connect with you over there. Tonight, actually, I'm involved in interviewing the author of the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, which is a really interesting conversation that we'll be having about relationships in the club that I call the Wayfinders Club, which is really about sense making and trying to understand how we make our way in a time that is rapidly changing. So that's great news on my side.
Excellent. Howard, anything from yourself or the world?
I would say the good news, particularly coming out of the pandemic for me, is the increased focus that lots of business people have on worrying about sense making and worrying about how they're going to come out of this. Much more scenario planning, much more attention to resilience of supply chains, and that's going to have a lot of downstream effects, I think, for all of us.
Terrific. My personal piece of good news actually combines pandemic news with personal stuff from my household. Even as we're speaking right now, my wife is out getting her second shot of the vaccination. So here in Seattle, we've been a little bit slow getting stuff underway, but it is now starting to reach people, particularly people in at-risk populations, and it's a huge load off of my mind. And it's also nice to know that other people in our community are starting to get the benefits of that. So the sun is rising after a long evening, I think, and I think that's good news for all of us. So that's a great way to get us into our topic of the conversation. So as I had mentioned, that the survey was trying to gauge the upside and what people think of, like what are the good things that are going to come out of this period? What are some new ways that we're going to look at ourselves, our institutions moving forward that's going to make us stronger? And the first question that we looked at was just, what is your basic outlook on how things are going to go for the next year? What's your positivity rating? And boy, for a bunch of glum futurists, we're awfully optimistic. According to the survey results, 51% says highly positive, 28% somewhat positive. That's a super majority on the upside. There are still a few folks that are seeing the glass half empty, or as I like to say, the toast landing butter side down. But it's a real minority moving forward. So I'm just panelists. First of all, does this reflect your views, and what do you think of this this survey? Let me start with Howard on this one.
My view is I break it down into short and long term. I've always subscribed to that theory that we tend to overestimate short-term impacts and overestimate or underestimate long-term impacts. So I would say I'm very, very positive long-term. The human species survives. It's not our first pandemic, as I like to remind folks. And so long-term, I think things are great. I'm somewhat cautious about the short-term.
Joan, how about you?
I would say that I'm not surprised about these results, given who are the likely people who responded to this, right? And what I'm seeing here in New York is that the experience of the pandemic is very, very different depending upon where you sit and what your experiences are. So I think that if we were polling more frontline workers, these numbers might be different. If we were polling grocery store clerks and people who are required to go to work in potentially dangerous circumstances, we would see different numbers. But I think for those of us who are looking at this from kind of a longer term and more systemic view, I can see that these numbers would make sense to me.
And how about you, Victoria?
Well, so myself, I'm optimist, and I believe it also, like, I will join the opinion of John. It is very much related to the personal situation of the people. And it happened to me to run the same week two seminars with the entrepreneurs in France. And one group of the entrepreneurs were from Paris, and the second one was from Bordeaux, which is west of France. And it was very interesting to see the reaction of the people from the same professional category, because people from Paris were literally complaining all the time because of the pandemic situation. And when I came to the second seminar, and I was expecting people to complain, and started from a big dose of empathy. And they said, listen, it's wonderful. It is wonderful weather. We have a wonderful living condition because we are having bigger houses in this area. And now we reconnected with our families because we rediscovered our wives and kids. So it's wonderful. And the research shown that the life conditions, the professional situation, and etc., the context in which we are right now impacting very much the situation. But I believe that we are all hoping the end of the pandemic situation and something on what we could build the projects. So optimistic.
No doubt. Excuse me, my mouse died here. There you go. So that's a good way to tee up the next part. So we dug into the aspects of this question about what we thought was going to be the parts of your life that are going to be best in the future, and it was divided up among work and professional life and entertainment. And some of the results that we got, what's going to be most improved once we find our way to the end of this. We saw that work and professional life, according to our survey, is the area that is going to be most improved, followed by home life, work, learning and education, health and leisure, and grooming and hygiene. I hope more than 1% of us will see improvements on that. I'm looking forward to that myself. But this is where we ended up with this, and I'm interested to see your reaction to the fact that the professional side of things has such a large lead over home life and learning and education. Howard, did you have some thoughts about that?
Yes, I think it's interesting. Having been the architect of IBM's work from anywhere policies starting around 1993, I mean, I've kind of lived in the marriage of home and work life for many, many years. And I kind of look at the top three, and they're all kind of interrelated to me, right? You're working from home, you're learning from home. So I'm kind of not surprised to see those up there. But the point I would raise on this one is there are certain things that we all individually control. Whether we get enough sleep, for example, is our decision, right? The quality of our work professional life, that's not totally up to us, right? There are many aspects of that that we do not control. And so I think it's going to be very, very interesting. You know, you're seeing some companies now telling employees you can work from home forever. You're seeing others saying, hey, we want you back in the office March 1st, right? So I think back to Joan's point from before, it's very dependent on where you are. The situations are going to be a little bit different. And I think this is a great wish list, I guess maybe I would call it, and something to aim for. But I think the jury's out.
Now, last month or 2 months ago, I did a Medium post for Gray Swan Guild on the deficiencies in our social life and how we're experiencing this pandemic through the medium of Zoom and teleconferencing and all of these unnatural ways of relating to one another. And so I personally was a little surprised that social life, or as it was said in the survey, socializing/communicating rated so low on this. And I'm wondering, you know, if we're actually going to be able to get some of these institutions and larger social structures back if we can't do some work to repair our, you know, intimate one-on-one relationships, either with our family or our friends. I'm wondering if Joan or Victoria, if either of you have any thoughts on that. Let's jump right in.
Yes. It is interesting because I also watched a couple of days ago the Harvard Business Review analysis about the feelings of the people about the conditions improving or declining. And 85% of the respondents told that it is still declining, and the major point of this decline was identified as the mental health, and the isolation was also quite present in there. So the lack of the connection is, I think, number one problem now for the people working from homes. And as Howard said, that we are having control on different parameters, and probably we are having more and more control on how we organize our work life when we are working from houses and from homes. But I also believe, like, the major difficulty comes, as people say, from the lack of this unexpected connections that we all make at the coffee machine, meeting someone in the corridors. So there is this lack of creative, unexpected things. So I know that a lot of the companies are working very much about creating in this new connected world the possibilities for people keeping this human connection. And for example, in my company, we are working from the remote offices, and even before the pandemics, from at least 3 different cities. We crossed quite well the pandemics sticking all together. But also we realized a study in the team, and also for 400, about 50 clients. And we analyzed how people feel this isolation related to their personality structure. And it appears like most of the female population Probably this is a good topic, by the way, John, for your discussion about Mars and Venus origins. Feel much more strongly this isolation. So I think that we really need something in the physical world. And once we will get back to the spaces, even if 40%, like for example, Russian companies don't plan to bring people back to the offices, that will be necessary to reinvent the life in the real space for the people to get together, to meet and to connect, and also to bring a little bit of the serendipity into it.
Joan, I know this is a focus of your practice as well.
Well, these numbers are really interesting to me. I think it's already been said, and I won't repeat, that work, home, and learning are somewhat integrated, especially for people who are being forced to do all of those things in one space. But I think that probably there has been more on-the-fly innovation in those areas. So the optimism may be that many organizations and education institutions, once they got through kind of that first 6 months or 5 months, have started to really be able to implement things that are beginning to help people see that they may have more agency over their experience at work. I think Howard was talking about there are things you can't control, but I think the feedback I've been getting is that people are feeling like they perhaps have more control than they had pre-pandemic, now that they have different kinds of choices, right? That they can work for a California company without having to move from New York as a potential future, now opens up opportunities for them. So I think I see some optimism there in the people that I'm interacting with. The social life number and play leisure, I interpret that anecdotally, obviously, just with this, not knowing the background and not having the ability to go deeper with people. I sense that people are less optimistic that these can be reimagined outside of one-on-one proximity in person. And so, yes, people are meeting online. Yes, they're having, kind of drinks with their friends on Zoom and so on and so forth. But I don't know that people are necessarily seeing the way forward to ways to feel that they're great in the interim and people are making the best of it. But I don't know that people are, at least the people that I'm interacting with, are feeling like that this is going to be a positive new way forward. It's really just a stopgap in many people's minds. I don't know that I agree with them. I think I may be more optimistic. I think some of the new tools that are coming out that are more integrative are interesting. And also many of the people who I know a lot of people who started dating people during the pandemic, people that they met online only and are having longer courting experiences, which I think is really interesting, right? Where they would have met in person and perhaps pursued their relationships in a different way. I'm hearing people say that they're developing deeper relationships with people because they don't have proximity and they're having to befriend one another for longer periods of time. It's like kind of old-fashioned letter writing, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, Joan, let me jump in here. To me, that's an extension or an acceleration of stuff we saw before. My wife and I met on eHarmony 16 years ago, right? And it was a virtual set of discussions for the first few weeks. Now, that was at the beginning of all this online dating stuff, but I agree with you that it provided us a lot of insight into each other before we actually met than we otherwise would have had. But what I think somebody in the chat just wrote that the head of Microsoft said we're seeing a compression of the time for digital transformation. And I think we're seeing acceleration of a lot of things that have been in the offing for a long time, in large measure, because that's the only game in town, number one, and then number two, because of the economics of it.
I mean, it feels to me, it's like, I think a lot of us has been involved in remote work and decentralizing organizations and things like that. It's touched on various aspects of our career. I know in your case, Howard, going back, to the 90s, and this is an issue that we've been looking at. It feels like this champagne bottle that we've been shaking up for 30 years, and we finally, we popped the cork on it, and
Right.
all of the innovations and all of the stuff that has come out that nobody thought, well, this is important to do, but it's not urgent. Now it's urgent, and that we've seen that kind of adoption. I'd like to move on because we've got a lot of ground to cover on this, but I think it's good to front load this and understand where everybody is coming from. One of the other facets of this question is, we looked at what the positive outcomes would be in a longer term horizon, in terms of post-pandemic solutions. And we got a real kaleidoscopic view of things, of responses to this question, everything from reinvention of arts and sports, to global economic recovery that extends more social equity and social justice, ways that our economic system is going to bounce back. I know that individually we discussed a few of these things in our pre-meetings. Do any of these jump out at you guys that you want to elaborate on, and talk about where the impact is we think is going to be most strongly felt? Victoria, what do you think?
Well, I make an observation that a lot of these potential post-pandemic solutions are related to the psychological or even spiritual issues that we have, because it looks like people are wishing to have a more harmonized, authentic human relationship, either both in work space and also in the personal lives. And probably for this, as Howard said, this separation and the boundaries that have been created by the pandemics also shown how we can build a relationship and how the relationship is important for our lives. And I believe that it's a lot of very positive outcomes will come from the better collaboration, and also valuing much more the relationship than the people. And I think that probably there will be a very huge change in the way how the organizations work, and we will see rather the hierarchical structure of the organization, rather like network of the relationship between people, and focus on this networking and the quality of the bonds that we have and attachment that we have for each other. And I see a lot of potential for both creativity and quality of life.
Absolutely. I want to continue this conversation, but I'm going to put up the next slide that organizes the responses to these a little bit better, so that we can see how these categories sort of break out and are ranked. Joan, did you have some thoughts on how these priorities kind of sort themselves out?
Well, I think it's interesting to me how I think that the optimism that we are seeing in these areas, or I hope that the optimism that we're seeing in these areas, are optimism based upon calling attention to the attention we need to pay to these issues, rather than viewing them as something that will organically emerge from this. If it's sorting out the priorities and attention that we are going to pay to these things, then I think that this is a really helpful way for us to begin to be problem finding and solution finding in these areas. Because I think that we have a lot of work to do in these areas to bring these things to fruition. And if the pressure of this pandemic has now shown the cracks in these areas, then I too am optimistic, as long as there's going to be action and activity behind this, rather than some sort of getting back to normal and moving past it.
Now, what I had shown you before was the 6 through 15. So that was the long tail answers. These are the top 5. Now, Howard, I know in our preliminary conversations, you had a slightly more contrarian view on how impactful this change was going to be, and what the driving force and vector of the change was going to be. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's so. It's kind of. I want to make sure I don't come across as negative on this, but I think if we look at human history, right, things change when the people who control the resources and the power see it beneficial to them, right? And so through human history, you either have evolution or you have revolution, right? And I think I look at the list of things that we've come up with, and it's a great wish list. To Joan's point, it's an excellent wish list.
Agenda.
But the question we have to ask ourselves is it going to take a revolution to cause some of these things to happen at scale? You can do anything in pilot mode or in small pockets. So to me, as I looked through all the results of this survey, I kept coming back to what are the economics, right? What are the drivers that are going to cause CFOs in companies to make decisions? And I'm talking more about the workplace elements now than I am the personal ones. And how is that going to be counterbalanced by the chief people officers or the CEO asking, how do I remain relevant in a marketplace that is changing or in an environment that is changing? I remain very positive that long term we're going to figure that out because we're very inventive. But I think getting from where we are, solving issues like mental health or more humane leadership, these are not easy things to fix. We've been at it a long, long time, and we have barely scratched the surface.
And I think it's very interesting the way that you tee it up. I mean, to me, it's like, the board has changed, but the pieces still move in the same ways.
Exactly.
So
that's a succinct way of saying it, Rob. Yeah.
Yeah, and that it's going to take a while for all of the stakeholders and players to understand what the change is and why they have to change their behaviors, because I think our default mode is to sort of go back to the same patterns of authority or patterns of behavior that existed pre-world, and there may be a period of adjustment for sure while we sort of kick the tires on some of these new models and while we overcome the skepticism and institutional resistance that's going to happen. I want to move on.
I just want to make one more point on this one, Rob.
Yes, sir.
I want to go back to Joan's point, and I'll say a little bit more strongly. The people we surveyed here, that sample, in my mind, is a bit biased. We are all more positive. We are all thinking about these issues. I think if we surveyed the general population, we'd get a very different set of answers than the ones that we got here. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that as a research organization.
And
Rob,
again, a great way to tee up the next topic here, which is what is the stuff that's been overlooked? And this is, we call ourselves the Gray Swan Guild. Well, the Black Swan is the completely unexpected, the out of nowhere. The Gray Swan is the less expected, and I think that our organization has come up with some interesting ideas around this. So in terms of overlooked long-term outcomes around educational institutions, living wage, what are some of these big tectonic shifts that we may see over the longer term? And you can continue on riffing from the previous set of stuff as well on that. Joan, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I would, and I'd love to be where we are, but also draw one point from the last slide as well. That whole question of positive work-life balance that showed up on the last two slides, that is very, very difficult to reconcile with the number of women who have left the workforce during this time, right? We have a ton of women who have left the workforce, whose way back into the workforce is still unclear, that we haven't calculated what will be lost by them losing this time in the workforce. And much of it has to do with, in order to get that positive work-life balance, we needed dual working couples needed to make hard decisions. And in many cases, the hard decisions were for professional women to leave work, to stay home and basically teach their children at home. And so these overlooked long-term outcomes, I think broadly for women in the workplace, may be profound. And so I'm optimistic if we're pointing toward looking at this. And I think some of these on this list, right, of these things that could very much be positive if we're viewing them as an agenda for change, not as things that will bubble up organically.
let me, so these are some of the longer term outcomes. I want to, some of this stuff we're going to have to skim over the surface a little bit because there's so much material to cover. In terms of overlooked shorter term outlooks, spiritual awakening, local and handmade goods. I mean, I think we've seen a real flowering of, when I was doing scenario planning, if you ever do scenario planning and you do sort of a quadrant grid, and there's always like it always turns out to be the lower left-hand corner of the grid is the problematic scenario, and that's where stuff doesn't seem to work out. And usually the solutions to, you know, institutional problems or economic collapse or all of the stuff that we're now seeing play out in real life is a reversion to local and sort of the historically, as Howard was saying, historically durable forms of human relationship, of economic activity. So we're seeing, you know, discernment skills, things around, you know, just the sort of basics, and you know, we're sort of narrowing our focus from the big down to the small. And I think that's something that is going to stay with us over the short term. I'd like to move on because our next topic is around improved relationships. And I know that we all have stuff to say around this, either from your personal experience. So the question here was, what relationships could be improved the most once we get through all of this? And this is what the survey said. Right? Children and friends at the top of the list, partner, spouse, professional colleagues, neighbors. Does that resonate with your personal experience, Victoria? Do you think this is the right order?
Well, I would say that it depends, and systematically looking at the relationship. Once someone has difficulties with the relationship, it can touch any of these areas. And interestingly, the issues that we are having here, they are more related for everything which is intangible, but providing tangible results. And as Howard said, like we are dealing in the materialistic world, where at the end of the day we are having KPIs. And of course, the areas where we didn't have any KPIs and we're living in a world of a lot of pressure, they suffered very much. And that's why in the previous slide, we've seen that people are dreaming and wondering about the change in the philosophy and the ideology, and the materialization of all that are relationship. So interestingly, during the pandemics, people rediscovered the relationship with kids, because when you stayed at the small apartment, working from home with your kids, and you had to take care of the whole family, you just rediscovered that there is another way, or you are limited in the solutions to deal with the kids' distress, schools, homework, and your own work, and also like a kitchen and so on. So my personal experience is now showing that a lot more and more people are wondering how to get the professionalization of being parents, how to learn to be a good parent, how to learn to be a good friend, and how to learn to be a partner and in life. And I believe that it's a lot of the possibilities now also to go through the re-educating people to manage this relationship even in the private life.
Now there is a downside to this, especially in the among partners and spouses, that we have seen an increase in domestic violence and things like that, because when you're trapped in the same space with your spouse. Victoria, were you sharing the data about that, or somebody in our pre-conversation, somebody had some really shocking numbers about how that is playing out?
Yes, at the beginning of the pandemics last year in both countries, in Russia and France, where I've seen the numbers, it was the increase of like 35% of the domestic violence, mainly to the women and kids. And it is an amazingly enormous number, and especially in the families where they are having a lot of members of the families and living in the very small space. So government, of course, like in France, is doing a lot of work for providing the additional security, but
yeah, I mean, there's a really poignant
it's an
comment
issue.
in the chat about what's going on in India, for example, where there's a huge amount of mental and domestic violence and pressures on those relationships, mostly on women because of unsupportive spouses and things like that. I'd like to move on to the topic of sort of professional connections and who were, which could be improved most out of the pandemic. Howard, I know you had a thought on this.
Yeah, I had actually put charities as my response, and I tied that back to the whole local nature of things. On that prior chart where we talked about picking up interest locally, I think that extends to charity as well. My sense is we've all it all depends on how you read this question, right? This is post-pandemic, and to me, I've already gotten closer to my medical professionals via telehealth, right, during the pandemic. And local government's doing a much better job communicating what's going on. So I kind of read this question and said, well, those are already improved. So I'm saying what's left to improve? And so from my standpoint, that's why I selected charities.
So Joan, I know that improving relationships between people and organizations and improving the performance of these things is a focus of your practice. What did you think of these two questions?
Well, I think that like looking at this list, it really, to me, just overarchingly becomes organizations, right? Because that's really what we're trying to pressure. This is a resilience question, right? This is an organizational resilience question to my mind. And so we test the cracks of organizations and relationships when we put pressure on. And so this has put not only an acute pressure, but also a long-term pressure, right? So this wasn't a disaster that came in and now tested the pressure, and then you bring in your emergency services and you move forward and you test that. And I think we actually tend to have really good systems for that. But this idea of a prolonged, long pressure has shown us where there are some challenges organizationally in general. So I think as an educator, I'm sure that's the lens that this question comes to me. I think of it as, have we developed the systems framing that we need to respond well to pressures on our organizations? And I think many organizations are still operating with hierarchical systems that were built for the mid 20th century. And we talk a good game about systems thinking, we talk a good game about nodes and decentralized and so on and so forth, but the implementation has not been there. And I think that this has shown that. So I think that we need to get in, and it ties back to more leadership development and different leadership development. It speaks to who are the people who are running these organizations, what are their priorities, and how do we get them to understand that they'll be more resilient if they employ some of this new thinking about how organizations can be more limber in a time that they have to be.
Well, Howard, I think that in our earlier conversation, you made that specific point about the education system in particular that was engineered for an earlier era.
Yeah, look, the rules for teaching children in this country have not changed in 100 years. And probably elsewhere around the world as well. I did work in a startup about 5 years ago on this, talking to some of the most progressive schools in the country. And you look at the infrastructure with which teachers have to work with, and that was built 100 years ago as well, down to the fact that they still ring a bell like everybody's working in a factory, right? I mean, it's really behind. And I want to be clear, I'm not faulting the teachers here. There are many teachers who try valiantly, and spend their own money to make things better. But at the end of the day, you have a system that is designed to meet a standard, right? To get people to, meets minimum standards. When what's really required now in every aspect of the stuff that we're talking about in this survey is much better critical thinking and problem solving skills, right? And and listening skills. We don't teach these things in school. And without that, the improvements that we're talking about here are going to take much longer to occur.
So speaking of improvement, so we have about 15 minutes left in the session give or take 2 minutes at the end for some housekeeping. So what I'd like to do is we're going to look at areas of innovation and solutions that are coming out of the pandemic. And I'm going to kind of run through the slides in a bunch, and then we can sort of come back and pick and choose the areas on that. So in terms of post-pandemic solutions around inventions and solutions, we had some really interesting ideas that were volunteered, in an open forum. So food delivery as government service, home isolation chambers, personal cybersecurity and privacy, augmented reality with the effects of hypnotism, like some really great, open-minded ideas about where this stuff is going to go, reinvention of social connections, so making virtual meetings as good as face-to-face, and really improvements in vivid telepresence and all of that sort of stuff. So these are some of the material innovations in the processes and technologies. The other aspect to this question was the habits that will stick. So what personal sense of mission and purpose are we rediscovering through the course of the pandemic that's going to emerge stronger? And some of the areas here were leading a more purposeful life really was that towering, champion here, followed by, eating better. So just better personal, taking care of ourselves. I think that this experience has really put the focus back on us, acquiring new skills, video streaming. So these were all, strong answers on this one. And then finally, the last category here was workplace improvements. And that some of the stuff that we already talked about, which was remote work and acceptance, more digitization. Interestingly, that there is less of a consensus on some of these topics. That obviously remote work is overwhelmingly the favorite. And then, you get digitization and technology barely breaking the majority. And then the rest of this stuff is a much more fragmented set of responses. So hope you've had a chance to digest all of that. Just general comments. Let me start with Victoria. Is there anything in this set of findings that jumps out at you as particularly salient, surprising, worthy of comment?
Well, so I would like to react to number one, remote work acceptance. Very interestingly, a lot of people are complaining about the working from home and lacking the social connections. And at the same time, they don't want to get back to the offices. I read a survey about 63% of people wanting to keep working from homes. And at the same time, a couple of days ago in Russia, there was also another article published about the fact that 25% of the Russian companies are planning to invest money in the IT solutions for the controlling people working from homes. And people are anxious about how it will look like if how intrusive is this control from the homes. And I believe that we are still here a lot of a very great field of the creativity to reinvent the remote work way of living, and maybe the new organizations which are not organizations anymore, as John said, probably something which is very new, like ecosystems of people working together.
Joan, how about you?
Two things come to mind on this. I think building on what Victoria is saying, I think we have to acknowledge that remote work acceptance, people didn't buy their homes that they're living in right now or rent the apartments that they're living in right now with the expectation of being full-time working at home. So I think there's just an adjustment period for all of this too. We may have changes that happen at work, and then humans, individual human families may need to adapt and may want to adapt, but the current circumstances they're in, maybe you went for the garage and you didn't go for the home office, and now you would make a decision for the home office. So there's an adjustment period that I think will have to take place. And then just a broad comment, because I know we're close on time, but I think many of these responses on this slide and the previous slides point to just the power of making time for reflection. And I don't think it comes up. It's kind of like a zoomed out overarching insight that can come from this is that it seems like people are responding in ways that having the time to reflect on what's important to them, this causing a pause is making people think more deeply. And I don't think we should lose that as an important skill or capacity that we should be encouraging in people in the long term. We shouldn't have to wait until we have a pandemic for people to value reflection and zooming out on what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how it's impacting themselves, their organizations, and the world.
And Howard, any quick thoughts on this before we move on to our final?
Yeah, I'll do three quick ones. Just a shout out to Mark Houghton. He made the point that we shouldn't refer to this as remote work, and I think he's right. This is work from anywhere, and it always has been designed as that way. I'm not quite sure where the remote name came from, but what I will say is, again, it depends on who you are. If you are an introvert, work from home is a wonderful thing. My son is an introvert, and he hated going into the office. So when this all happened, he was all smiles. The world's coming to him at this point. Now, if you're an extrovert, right, obviously the opposite is true. So there's a bit of that to look at from the work from anywhere perspective. From the tech perspective, the one thing we haven't really touched on is the ethics underneath all that. And whether it has to do with job loss due to automation or the ethics of AI, these are very, very important topics to discuss. And then on the other three, my theory as to why they're so low, Rob, back to your observation, is that these are the things that are outside your control. Because the question is, does your company's management agree? Again, this is your view, saying you're hoping that there's an appreciation for work-life balance. Maybe not in your company. Maybe now they think they can send you an email at 8 o'clock at night, whereas when you weren't working from home, that was kind of considered bad form. So I think there's a lot to tease out underneath this.
Fantastic. Well, with our remaining time, let's go to the long-term question here. And Howard, I know you've been urging us to take the long historical view, and this was a really interesting question. 50 years from now, what will they write about the positive legacy of the pandemic? Positive legacy of the pandemic. I hope that we will all be around to hear that, but in the event that we're not, here's some of the headlines that that people contributed. Awakened to our fullest potential. Planetary disaster averted. Interesting one. Jolt toward a balanced way of life. Reconnecting humanity. Respect the data, reject the drama. Love that one. Lots of interesting ideas here. Let me start with Joan. And what do you think? What would your headline be?
My hope is that it will be that it was a wake-up call, and that it took theory and moved it to action.
Excellent. Victoria?
My hope as well is that there will be the shift in the humanity, and we will go to something which is with more equanimity and more equilibrium between the human activities and the planet.
And Howard?
Well, certainly I share the hopes that that both Victoria and Joan speak to. Although when I looked at this question, I was thinking in terms of the headlines. What would be kind of a pithy headline here about something that we might think of today as being anachronistic, right? So, today, dialing a phone, right? Young people don't know what dialing a phone is. So what would be the equivalent 50 years from now? And the headline I came up with was, Daddy, what was a carpool? Right? And the notion being long commutes to work, packed in a car with other people. If we're successful in changing the kinds of things we're talking about here, nobody's going to know what that is. So that was my cute way of attacking this question.
Yeah, people who know me know that I'm a great big nerd, and I'm really into comics and visual storytelling and things like that. And so there was a really interesting comic strip that was done on this subject, and of individual people contributing just in a one-panel scenario what the future would look like. And there was one that was 50 years, and it's an older woman, and she's greeting her grandson, and she's saying, remember, give Nana the special hug. And they were like touching elbows and stuff, because the experience of this year was so deeply imprinted on that woman as a young girl that for the rest of her life, she carried with her these practices, in the same way that maybe our grandparents carried with them the habits formed in the Great Depression, or these other traumatic moments. So really interesting stuff here. Now, since there's 4 college professors here, we're going to have to leave you guys with some homework. And that is a question for you to think about and possibly even respond to in your own contributions to content to the Guild moving forward. What did we learn from this? What makes you hopeful? What gets you excited? What's your big takeaway? What did we miss? And what should be our future agenda for investigation? And I hope, we're running out of time on this particular webinar, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for future feedback. Actually, so before we get to the top of the hour, let me go through a little bit of Guild housekeeping here. So if you're thinking about ways to answer these questions, to participate, to move forward, some really exciting stuff coming up. So March 26th, how time flies when things are slow to a crawl, is the 1-year anniversary of the founding of the Gray Swan Guild. So there's some big stuff coming up around the Day of the Swan. I don't have any special insight into that, but it sounds exciting and sounds like fun. We have lots of different ways to engage and participate. So we've got, if you want to be part of the Guild and part of the governance structure of the Guild, as a community member, as a leader, organizer, facilitator, building out our network, joining the Global League of Sensemakers, which is the talent stream that this terrific panel has been drawn from. Lots of ways to do that. If you are a writer and you want to put your content in writing, we have our Gray Swan Medium channel as an opportunity to participate. I've done a piece. Have any of you guys done Medium pieces yet for the Guild?
Not yet.
Not yet. So some great opportunities coming up with that. And then there's also separately, there's the POVs and things. And I know that some of you are doing, there's some podcasters. Joan, you're nodding your head. You're part of the podcast network here. What's your podcast?
I'll be working on the Liminal podcast. Surprise, surprise.
Terrific. Anybody else involved in the podcasting side of the business? These all look like great ones.
I'm working on a concept around exposing interesting customer service stories, both positive and negative, for learning purposes. So more on that to come.
Well, these all represent big steps forward in the Guild's efforts to make gray exciting again. So all of these, the Gray Swan Hour, the Gray Word, Beyond the Gray Areas, we've got a theme going here, but it's not your father's gray. This is a new gray for new times. We've got some upcoming productions and publications. So what you got in this podcast was a first look at these survey results. This will be gathered up and published as a journal, as some content that you can read more about the deep dive. You can refer to these findings in your own work moving forward. And then finally, the Gray Swan Research, Sensemaking, and Intelligence Group. So there's lots of channels for participation. The links to join the Guild, again, are here. What I'd like to leave you with is I'd like to go through each panelist and let people know how they can stay in touch with you and your ideas and your thinking, where they can hear more from you. Victoria, what's the best way to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, the best way is to connect with me on the LinkedIn or Instagram or in the Clubhouse. And I invite everyone to my new podcast on the Clubhouse for the Russian-speaking countries, which is called Wisdom Garage.
Joan, how about you?
LinkedIn and Clubhouse are the best for me right now, and I'm Joan P. Ball at both.
Excellent. Howard?
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn is probably best. I've joined Clubhouse, like many other folks. I'm still trying to find my way around. I do enjoy inviting other people into this, though, and it's certainly a very cool place. If you've not heard of it, don't miss it. This is one that looks like it's got wings.
Excellent. Well, I am not cool enough to be on Clubhouse yet, unfortunately. The best place to follow me is obviously hit me up on LinkedIn, join my network. I'm also on Twitter at Rob Salk, where I promote my various writings at Forbes and the other places that I write publicly in between berserk political rantings and which are getting less and less because I'm becoming a little more relaxed about current events in public policy than I was for the last few years. But at Rob Salk is the best way to find me. And the website for my business is robsalkowitz.com. Let me thank everybody. First of all, a big hand to our panelists. Thank you guys for sharing your insights and wisdom with the rest of us today. Big shout out to the master swans behind the scenes, Sean Moffat, Andrea Cates, Rob Tyree, and the rest of the group that are making this event and the other events happen. Thanks to all of you again for sharing your day with us. I'm gonna wrap up here, but I hope that we can keep the conversation going through these various channels. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day, evening, or wherever the rest of the week takes you.